Okay, hi. Thanks for joining. So this is a brief overview of the area of working memory um, and the developing brain, and it's in support of the tutorial I'm going to be running on my 2020 Current Directions in Psychological Science paper. I'd like to think about working memory in a dynamic world, starting with the example shown here. This is a little video I shot when my son was young. I think he was probably 5 years old, and he was just learning how to play football. And what I like about this is you can see just how challenging it is to learn this embodied real world sport. You can see right now the ball just went out of bounds, and it's really interesting to watch the players all kind of organize their behavior around the guy who's throwing the ball in, and contrast that with everybody just sort of following the ball around as a pack. And if you think about this example, you can kind of see there's a dynamic balance between distraction and focus. So if you watch the video carefully, or if I replayed it, you'd notice some of the players are kind of what we call picking daisies, just sort of looking all over the field and not really engaged in the match. Other players are actively following the ball, but not necessarily focused on whether they're currently on offense or defense. So I think one of the real challenges for kids learning how to play football is to learn how to hold one focus in mind, follow the ball, and then switch to a new focus, like organize your behavior around the throw-in routine. And working memory plays a key role in holding these goals in mind. And part of the reason why I like this example is we often think of working memory as a very cognitive thing, probed maybe in laboratory tasks. But this makes it clear that actively holding information in mind for a short period of time plays a central role in pretty much everything we do, including activities like sports, which are thought to be more sensory motor in nature. So today in my little presentation, here's what I'm going to cover. First, I'm going to tell you about a little bit about the background research in the area of working memory from the developmental perspective, and show you that children go from holding roughly one item in memory during working memory during infancy to 3 to 4 items by 10 years of age. And the central question I'll focus on is how does this happen? When we ask that question in recent times, we usually turn to something like neuroimaging. And so I'll show you some data showing that the brain changes pretty dramatically. But knowing that the brain changes dramatically doesn't necessarily answer this question of how does this improvement happen. I'll then turn to computer models and talk to you about how we've approached this question of how working memory develops using dynamic field theory. Okay, so first, what is working memory and how does it change over development? There are different varieties of working memory. So working memory is thought to be a memory system that holds information in an active state in the service of mental operations. Classic example is mental rotation. The notion of working memory contrasts with short-term memory, in that working memory is thought to be an active storage system, whereas short-term memory is characterized by passive decay. Working memory also contrasts with longer-term memory, primarily in terms of the time scale. So long-term memory is for storage of information over long periods of time, whereas working memory is typically thought to be active between roughly 1 to 30 seconds. Historically, working memory has been divided up into verbal working memory and visuospatial working memory. Verbal working memory is working memory for verbal information, such as the articulatory loop in Baddeley's original model. On the flip side, you have visuospatial working memory. Originally, that was talked about in terms of a visuospatial sketchpad, which is now typically just called spatial working memory. And then there's also something called visual working memory, which is visual or working memory for things like colors and shapes and so on. If we zoom in on visual working memory, that's what the remainder of this talk is going to be on. So visual working memory is a central cognitive system used over 10,000 times each day to remember and compare items that cannot be simultaneously foveated and to detect changes in the world when they occur. So what you see here is essentially the idea of a working memory system that is actively engaged many, many times each day in the service of detecting changes over the short time scale of one look to another look to another look. Just to give you an example, here is my old lab at Iowa. You know, it's Iowa because there's snow outside. And I'm sitting here working on a model. I turned to the water cooler and turned back. And the question is, did you notice a change? And usually when I'm giving a talk on this, I'll rewind, give people a chance to look at the first display and the second display. And typically everyone noticed that the mug has changed. And the reason the mug changed is because my colleague who was working next door actually accidentally grabbed the wrong mug. Now this is supposed to be a relatively easy change detection because you're seeing a dramatic change in the color of the mug. You can also do something more subtle and change from coffee to tea. So if you notice in the first example, it was a black coffee cup here, and now we've added the tea bag. So that's a more subtle featural detail that might be harder to detect in the world. Okay, so basically visual working memory is a capacity limited storage system, holds visual information in mind such that when you look to the water cooler and look back, you can notice changes in the world, such as the coffee cup changing. There's a lovely video on YouTube from Dan Simons. Many people have seen this, so I don't usually show this in my talks, but it's an excellent video that shows how limited visual working memory capacity is. Okay, so that's what visual working memory is. I can also tell you a little bit about its development. Visual working memory is a great target for work on early development because we can measure it early. Individual differences in infancy are predictive of school outcomes up to 11 years later. So this is work from Susan Rose and her colleagues showing that you can measure properties of visual cognition in infancy, and then those predict school outcomes 11 years later, which is quite remarkable. Visual working memory is also open to intervention, such as parenting interventions. And there's some lovely work by Susan Landry showing the effectiveness of trying to modify aspects of visual cognition early in development with, for example, preterm infants. Okay, if we look at how we measure changes in visual working memory over development, my lab and other labs worldwide have been using this preferential looking task shown in the two panels on the left. And then typically when we get to older children and adults, we use the change detection task shown here on the right. If I look at the preferential looking task first, what you can see is we show infants and young children two displays that are side by side. The display is visible for 500 milliseconds. It disappears for a 250 millisecond delay. This is the memory retention period. And then a new display comes up. And if you look carefully, you can see on the left side in this example, the two colors are always the same. And on the right side, one of the colors always changes. So in this case, from orange to yellow, and then from green to brown. And across trials, we can then manipulate how many items are on each display to probe the capacity of working memory. So we might have one item on each display, two items, or three items, as you can see here. The idea with this task is that if infants, let's say, look to the no change side first, and let's say they have a working memory capacity of two items, then what they should be able to do is hold red and blue in mind for this short retention interval, such that when red and blue are represented, they should notice that these are the same colors they saw before, and then another memory retention interval, same as before, and eventually that sameness should cause them to release fixation and look at the other display. When they look at the other display, if they can remember two items, they should encode that there's a green and orange item. Remember that during the delay. And then when the next display shows up, they can effectively detect the change. And that change detection should hold their attention to the changing display. And the idea is that infants like to look at novelty. So the novelty that they're detecting here should cause them to look longer at the changing side relative to the no changing side. And we call that difference the change preference score. So if we sum up all the looking to the changing side and divide it by their total looking, if they have a good working memory for this number of colors, they should show a high change preference score or above chance looking to the changing side. Now let's consider what should happen if they don't have a good working memory. Let's say they start off again looking at the no change side, but now they can only remember one color. Essentially, then when they look at the second display here, they may selectively focus on red, for example, and if they happen to store red, they might notice that sameness. But there's also the second color in the display, which then should be novel. So the idea is that if they don't have a working memory for two items, we should basically get 50-50 looking between the no change and the change displays. Okay, if we roll forward in development, we use the change detection task. This is much more straightforward task. Show people an array of 1, 2, or 3 colored squares, for example. You notice the delay is longer because working memory is more robust later in development. And then we show them a test display. And here they just make an explicit same different judgment. Right. So in this case, they should say different, noticing that the blue item has become green. All right. So those are the tasks we use. Here's the, just to give you a sense for this, this is actually the preferential looking task. This was from a study we did in India, looking at visual working memory in early development with at-risk kids. I'll just play this for you. The screen at the top shows the display. This is from the child's perspective, right? So if you're noticing the changing side is over here on the left, that's his left. Play this for you again. You notice the trial starts with a detention getter and then these blinking, flashing squares, right? And what I want you to notice, if you look at the child's behavior, is that, I'll play it for you one more time. He looks back and forth initially. Back, forth, there we go again. And then eventually settles in on the changing side and has a nice long look to that changing side. So that would drive a strong change preference score, which would be above chance responding in this case. Okay, so using data from these two tasks, here's a nice graph that Vanessa Simmering put together showing how visual working memory capacity changes over development. So here's the initial data point from the preferential looking task. You could see kids start with a capacity of about one item. By 3 years to adulthood, you can see this nice gradual change from a capacity of about 2 items upward to about 4.5 items. The different colored lines are from different studies. So the red study, the green, blue, etc. And what you could see is when you aggregate across everything, a nice continuous developmental change showing an increase in visual working memory capacity over development. Now, I'm not highlighting in this talk, but there are some really interesting differences across the tasks. So in preferential looking, you see actually a real boost in capacity early on, whereas change detection is a much harder task and shows a lower capacity from early development to later development. A lot of interesting features between these two tasks. And if you're interested, Vanessa Simmering's 2018 monograph of SRCD is a fabulous paper that highlights exactly what's going on in these two tasks and puts together a lovely dynamic field model that captures both data from the two tasks as well as longitudinal data, not longitudinal data, cross-sectional data over development. So I'll refer back to that paper at the end of the talk. Okay, so the big question here is basically, how does this happen? We've got this kind of smooth, continuous change over development in the capacity of working memory. So what's going on under the hood to create this change? Okay, so how does working memory change? And for this, I'm going to look to the brain for insights. Just going to highlight one exemplar study here. This is a paper from Kwan et al. 2002. They were looking at visuospatial working memory with fMRI. So they did a cross-sectional study from about 7 up to into young adulthood. They asked participants to do a spatial two-back task and then a control task where they just had to detect the presence of an item in the center. For those of you who might be less familiar with the spatial two-back task, there's a 3x3 grid in front of you. Dots are appearing in the grid, right? And if you see a spatial repetition, you're supposed to notice the difference. So if the dot appears in the lower left and then the center and then goes back to the lower left, that would be a spatial repetition, if I'm remembering the task correctly. Because two back, you hit the same location. Hopefully that's correct. If I got that wrong, I won't record fixing that later on. So okay, so what you're looking at in the data are accuracy performance in that two-back task. You can see accuracy gets better over development. That's what you might expect. You can see reaction times get faster over development. That's what you would expect. In terms of the control task of just detecting when an item appears in the center, you can see kids are quite good at that. So that was, you get ceiling performance in that easy task. There are changes in reaction time over development. So this was a nice control variable in their statistical analyses. So then what they did is they looked at the brain activity while participants were doing this task and found that increases in brain activity associated with improvements in performance. There were increases in brain activity associated with improvements in performance with age as the strongest predictor. So you see increases in brain activity in the left prefrontal cortex, the right prefrontal cortex over age, again, left prefrontal cortex here and right left posterior parietal cortex and right posterior parietal cortex. Okay, so you're seeing changes in brain activity here in prefrontal cortex, and then also here in posterior parietal cortex, two brain areas we would kind of expect to be involved in spatial working memory. Okay, so nice developmental changes in the study. This is kind of one of the first pioneering studies using fMRI to look at developmental questions. And very exciting data, but it doesn't really explain how these changes happen, right? So these data highlight which brain networks change, but they don't really explain how this change occurs. Now, underneath the hood, we might introduce some ideas here to try to explain brain development in this case. One idea from the MRI literature is that working memory skills emerge as the brain matures. This is a video from a cross-sectional structural MRI study looking at the myelination of cortex. And the thought is that maybe, as the brain is myelinating, that is leading to, for example, faster neural conduction for the networks involved in, say, a visual working memory task. And that faster conduction leads to faster reaction times, for example. Very plausible idea. From my perspective as a developmentalist, in some ways, this explanation is a bit lacking, just because it shifts the question to a different level. So, we could say, how does working memory develop? Well, it develops because the brain is maturing or because of brain myelination. Okay, well, that maybe brain myelination is involved there, but we then need to ask the next question, which is, what explains those patterns of brain maturation or brain myelination? These types of explanations are also kind of not very not what's the word I'm looking for. They don't lead to real straightforward avenues if you're interested in intervention, right? So if brain myelination is causing changes in visual working memory over development, then we don't really have strong methods for intervening with kids because we can't directly affect brain myelination, at least not with current methods. So we've opted to kind of consider this question from a different perspective, which was to think about what brain models might contribute to discussions around this developmental question. So we're going to then turn to our dynamic field model. So this now gets into my current directions in psychological science paper. I've got another video on the DFT website that walks through this model kind of step by step. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but the basic idea with this model is to think about first, how do we conceptualize change in working memory capacity? Do we want to think about it as like you're growing a new slot you can put things into, or might we think about it as a more continuous thing relative to, let's say, how the cortical dynamics that sustain activation in working memory, kind of think about developmental changes from that framework. So in that picture, working memory becomes a little bit more of a continuous thing. So what you're looking at here is a model. It's a dynamic field model. In the top left panel here, where you're seeing, I presented the model with, let's say, 3 colors, red, blue, and green. And I've kept the colors on, and when they're on, I get these nice peaks of activation reflecting essentially the encoding of the colors. And then working memory in this context would be sustained activation even when the colors are turned off or removed. So in the simulation, what I'm doing is I'm presenting 3 colors for a certain period of time, maybe a couple of seconds, and then I'm turning the colors off and I'm asking, is the model able to actively maintain those colors in this working memory state or active memory state? What you can see in the first panel is that only the, let's see, if I said red, blue, green, only the green color is actively maintained during the delay. Whereas a little bit later, you can see the model is actively maintaining 2 of the 3 colors. And then even later, the model is actively remembering all 3 colors. So here we're sort of mimicking the change from a working memory capacity of 1 item to 2 items to 3 items. And the question in the paper is what essentially neural mechanisms might underlie that. And in this model, first, what we showed is that if we increase the strength of excitation and inhibition, we can actually successfully model this particular developmental change. So down below, I'm showing you what's called our interaction function in the dynamic field model. So that consists of how the interaction function says how each site in the field interacts with the other sites. And we use a local excitation surround inhibition type function. So neurons that are let's say, actively firing above their resting level will excite their local neighbors in color space. So other neurons that are tuned to similar colors and inhibit neurons that are tuned to different colors. And through this local excitation surround inhibition function, we get localized peaks of activation that encode particular colors. But as we strengthen those peaks by increasing excitation in this case, we are able to actively maintain those peaks during a delay, even when the color is removed. Okay, so this kind of shows conceptually how increases in the strength of neural excitation within a cortical network could increase the robustness of working memory and the capacity of working memory. Okay, so again, how stronger excitation leads to more robust working memory and increases in capacity. And then the question is, where do those increases in excitation come from? Could be this links back to the myelin story. That's one way to think about it. But we wanted to push this one level further and looked at how essentially memory traces or longer-term memory formation might be related to working memory. So this is a very similar simulation to the one I just showed you, but we've added what we call a memory trace to the model. So now basically, anytime the model forms a peak somewhere in the field, it drives up the excitation or the activation in a memory trace layer, which then feeds back on working memory. We've used this in lots of dynamic field models in the past, and it basically has kind of like a priming effect. So if I see a color I've recently remembered, that memory trace can boost excitation locally, which makes peaks stronger and more robust. So what I'm showing you in this simulation is the same points in development, early in infancy, childhood, and adulthood in the right column. In these simulations, the interaction function is identical, but now what I'm changing is I've added this cyan memory trace here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run a number of simulations where I'm going to show 3 colors randomly distributed across color space. And what you're going to see across the 3 panels is this cyan line in the back starts to get boosted globally. So you can see by the end, there's a very strong memory trace, which is that cyan line. And what's happening then is basically by actively remembering different locations over and over again in working memory and via diverse exposure to different colors, that is essentially leading to this somewhat homogeneous boost in your memory trace, which is a kind of learning-based mechanism for how you might get a global boost in excitation. So what this is trying to capture is the idea that, on the previous slide, I'm changing the excitation by hand as the modeler, but in the next slide, I'm not changing excitation by hand. I'm just letting the model learn, and through distributed experience, it's sort of changing its own excitation. And from my perspective, that's a really attractive view of how to think about development. So as experience accumulates, working memory capacity increases and working memory abilities generalize across those distributions of experience of, in this case, different colors. Okay, so the central concept here is that the brain might develop itself through generalized experience. Okay, so just to kind of sum up, I think that there's a lot of exciting brain imaging data out there looking at the development of working memory. In general, these brain data are really revealing, but they tend to focus on the question of which brain areas are changing over development. If we want to push forward, I think neural models can really contribute in this regard by focusing in on that how question. So how does change occur? And I just showed you one example of how we've started to explore that idea in the domain of visual working memory. And I think, I mentioned the myelin story was unsatisfying in terms of interventions. So let me kind of come full circle on that idea. I think this work gives us really interesting insights about intervention. It gives us a sense for how working memory operates, and that experience matters. And so the idea that we're working on in collaboration with others is that maybe we could encourage caregivers to help provide just the right experiences for each child to boost working memory and context. And that might, enable us to develop more effective interventions guided by neural models. And I think more generally, it gives us tools to assess changes in working memory as children develop as well. So the model could actually provide targets for intervention work. So we could, for example, run simulations of here's a hypothesized intervention with a child, and we can do that actually in a model that's embedded in sort of a real world context, but then pull that model out into like a laboratory context and test it. And that gives us ways to assess, is the intervention actually working with a real child step by step by step, without having to implement the entire intervention and only check at the end whether it worked. So these are kind of ideas that we're exploring. Just as pointers to a couple papers following this talk, that idea about intervention was explored in a 2014 paper with Sammy Peroni, published in Frontiers. I'll put a link on the Dynamic Field website about that. And then previously I mentioned Vanessa Simmering's monograph paper, which is where she did a really lovely job of looking at the preferential looking task and the change detection task, what makes them different, and how to track capacity differences over development using both tasks. So kind of important pointers to both of those papers. Okay, I think that's the end of this little tour. As I said, I'll put a link to a couple papers on the Dynamic Field website. Hope you enjoyed the little overview here, and hopefully see you all at the tutorial.